Hey everyone, in this video we're going to explore the magical process of turning your wild-caught microbes into an actual usable garden soil amendment. If you've never heard of IMO3, 4, or 5, I'm truly stoked you're watching this. If you need some additional context for how we got here, you may want to check out our last video on IMO, stages 1 and 2. And in case you're new to the channel, I'm Taylor and I help gardeners grow in more sustainable, regenerative, and let's be honest, exciting ways. If you would like to follow along at home and actually do this yourself, you can check out our free Beginner's Guide to IMO PDF, the revised and updated version. It will be linked in the video description, and that's going to get you started beyond just watching this video, of course. And so without further ado, let's hop in. To start, I'll just give a quick reminder of how we collect these indigenous microorganisms in the first place. We start by cooking a grain substance. Traditionally, it's white rice, but I and others, now that I've gotten to hear from a bunch of you guys, have found better success with a number of different grains. We take this grain and place it in a container of some kind, something that can be used more than once, ideally, like a reed basket or a box like this one made of cedar. We put this out in the forest underneath the leaf litter where we can see visible mycelium strands, and then we wait a few days until we eventually retrieve it. I just outlined this process in greater depth if you would like to check that video out. Once we actually get our collection of colonized grain, we have to preserve it somehow. And the best way that we've got to do this is to dehydrate it using sugar. And this is going to draw out moisture from the inoculated grains and dehydrate the microbes that we just caught. What we're left with is a relatively shelf-stable version of the microorganisms that we just caught from the forest. In case I didn't say it already, or if it wasn't immediately obvious, the purpose of catching and preserving these IMOs is so that we can introduce them to our garden soil. The thing is, we're not quite ready to apply these microbes to the soil yet. And a big question that I get a fair amount is, why can't we just use these right away in our garden? Especially if they're supposedly the best of the best microbes, strong and resilient and adapted to our climate. And there are a few reasons for that. And each additional stage that we take these microbes through is going to serve a certain function that will answer that question. So hang on to it and let's get into the way that we make IMO stages 3, 4, and 5. And the way that I've really come to understand the thing that we're about to do is by breaking it up into 3 categories of ingredient. So we've got here with our IMO 2 is what we would call an inoculum. And don't let that word scare you off. An inoculum is simply something that we use to inoculate or infect something else. The something else, in this case, we're going to call a substrate. Now, at its core, that's all we need. An inoculum and a substrate mixed together will eventually become an inoculant for our garden soil. So to sum it up, an inoculum plus a substrate equals an inoculant. However, there are other ingredients that we can add that will help create the conditions that will favor the inoculum as it is inoculating the substrate. And these are what I call microbial curators. They're extra added ingredients, food sources, enzymes, hormones, and nutrients that are going to curate the environment of the substrate in which the inoculum will do its thing. I'll get practical here in a sec, but let me conclude by saying that the microbial curators for each of the stages of IMO, 3, 4, and 5, are going to stay the same. What changes is the inoculum and the substrate. To give a different example of something like this would be like sourdough bread. To make sourdough bread, you need a sourdough starter that will inoculate the rest of the dough to make the loaf. To make that starter, you combine yeast, water, and flour. The yeast comes from the air initially, but eventually it's just like the leftover starter that you had from a previous batch. The substrate is the flour, and the water provides the necessary hydration for the yeast to travel through the substrate and inoculate it properly. Once that happens, you've got your inoculant that can be used to make bread. When we make IMO 3, the inoculum, as I've already mentioned, is the IMO 2. That is our leftover yeast. And the substrate for IMO 3 is a combination of carbon-rich material and carbohydrate-rich material. These are the ingredients that we're going to combine and tend to in order to achieve our IMO 3. Now, as we transition to making IMO 4, our IMO 3 becomes our inoculum. Okay, IMO 3 is what we're using to inoculate the IMO 4 substrate, which is native garden soil. Soil that you scoop up for your property, your garden beds, your field, your food forests, wherever you're growing. That soil is the substrate for IMO 4. Once we get our IMO 4, we can either use that as our soil inoculant, or we can use it as an inoculum for yet another stage of IMO, you guessed it, IMO 5. And in this case, the IMO 4 is the inoculum, and the substrate is a compost or an animal manure or collection of crop residue. Each time we take our IMO collection through to another stage, two main things are happening. One, the microorganisms are diversifying, and two, they're multiplying. This is a very rich soil inoculant that we're making, so each time that we expand the inoculum past IMO3, we're only going to be doubling it in size. Now, the missing piece to the puzzle is our suite of microbial curators, and for these we have 5 main ingredients that when mixed together in water create something that I like to call IMO water. I came up with that all myself, not the ingredients, the name of the mixture of the ingredients. Yep. So the ingredients are fermented plant juice, vinegar, oriental herbal nutrient, seawater, and humic acid. They're going to perform several functions as we try to get our IMO inoculum to take hold within each of the substrates. Like I said before, these microbial curators are going to be providing nutrients. They're going to help crowd out bad microorganisms. They're going to supply enzymes that will help facilitate the process of inoculation. They're doing work. But if you don't have any of these ingredients, no fret, just adding dechlorinated water alone to hydrate your IMO3, 4, and 5 piles will do the trick. It's just, if you've got the ingredients, it's gonna help them run a little bit smoother. For IMO3, I like to start by mixing my dry ingredients and my wet ingredients separately, just like baking. For your carbon-rich materials, you've got options. You can go with wood chips, wood shavings, straw, dried leaves, dried grass clippings, shredded cardboard. The main thing, as always, is that you want these materials to be clean. And by clean, I mean you don't want a bunch of ink on your shredded cardboard. You don't want herbicides contaminating your grass clippings or straw. Just play it safe and use what is available in your area and what you know is not going to contain a lot of contaminants, because those are going to kind of throw off the microbes that you're trying to culture. For carbohydrate-rich materials, you've got multiple options. Same rules apply as for the carbon materials, clean and local if possible. Eventually, I would love to be able to grow all my own materials that I use for making IMO3, but for now, I've got a good source of whole oats and wheat bran. You can use rice bran or spent grains. Look for things that are cheap. You can use flour if you want, but it's not really the most cost-effective usually. And then an optional addition is going to be your charcoal. You don't want to overdo it. This won't count as your carbon source because the fungi won't be able to feed on it like they do the leaves and wood chips and stuff. But by adding a little bit of activated charcoal or even just regular charcoal, it's going to give those microbes more space to spread out and multiply. So it's a pretty great addition. Mix these up together. I like to do this in a wheelbarrow so that it's a little higher and easier on the old back muscles. Plus, once I'm done mixing, I can just wheel it over to wherever I'm going to let it ferment. Once I've got the dry materials mixed up, I mix the wet ingredients. And in the case of IMO3, that includes the inoculum, right? So first things first, I make my humic acid via a very complicated set of processes. First, I take a few handfuls of homemade woody compost, I put it in a paint strainer, and then I take that tea bag and I steep it in my water and gently tap it against the side of the bucket to release the humic acid. If you have store-bought humic acid, you can use 2 ounces or 56 grams worth. I just like to do it this way because I don't have any humic acid right now, and compost contains good amounts of it. After doing this, for 4 gallons of dechlorinated water, I add in an ounce of IMO2, and you'll notice that I'm using multiple sources of IMO2. I've got a bit of a collection, and I want to maximize the microbial diversity. Different collection sites are going to contain a slightly different profile of their microbial makeup, so I'm using several of them here. If you've only got one good one, that's all you need. And then I'm adding an ounce or 28 milliliters of FPJ and apple cider vinegar. I'm adding only 1/3 of an ounce or around 10 mils of OHN because OHN becomes more potent as it ages. Mine is a year old, but for less than a year old OHN, you'd add 1/2 ounce. And then for the seawater, I don't live near the ocean or any salty body of water, so I'm using my own homemade salt water made from unrefined sea salt, and I'm adding about 16 ounces of that to this 4-gallon bucket. Once this is all in there, I like to give it a good swirl and I start to hydrate my dry ingredients. Now, I wish I could give you an exact formula that would work every single time the exact same way perfectly with no variation. But the truth is the amount of IMO water that you will need to hydrate your substrate with will entirely depend on the dryness or dampness that your materials are starting out at. It'll depend on what materials you're using or what combination. It'll also depend on your climate and what you find works best for you as you ferment your materials. But as a general rule of thumb, we're shooting for a level of dampness similar to what you'd get the ingredients in a hot compost pile too. Something that clumps when it's squeezed but falls apart when it's tossed. You don't want it crazy sopping wet, but you don't want any dry pockets. Get it hydrated, but not dripping a ton. I like to make mine a tiny bit wetter than what I've seen other people do. That's because the climate that we're growing in is crazy dry, and without that moisture, our piles dry out in moments. It does help when the outdoor temperatures are a little bit more temperate. I made this particular IMO3 pile when it was still fairly warm out, but just starting to cool down at the end of the summer. Anyway, you'll have to get a feel for it by actually doing it. Don't just watch me do this, experience this for yourself. Now, once I've got this all mixed up and hydrated and dumped out onto its fermentation zone, we want to make sure that this pile is properly oriented, dimensionally speaking. I shoot for between 8 to 16 inches high, give or take a few inches. For this pile size, the height of the pile is going to dictate how well the materials hang onto the heat, and that's going to start generating. If you're forming your pile in direct sunlight or where it gets hit for a few hours out of the day, you will want to keep your pile mulched with a carbon-rich material like your leaves or straw or whatever you've got. This is going to keep the pile moisture levels managed, and it's going to protect the microbes on the outer edges from getting zapped and killed off by the ball fire in the sky. The spot that I am making my piles in here is fully shaded for 100% of the day, so I'm leaving it uncovered. And y'all, I just have to say, after having made many of these piles, dozens, it still genuinely surprises me and excites me when they heat up. You're most likely going to want to invest in a compost thermometer for this project. You can use a meat thermometer if you want, but compost thermometers are really not that expensive these days. What you're going to see happen as this pile sits is the temperature is going to begin to rise. After a day, you should start to see the pile heat up past 90, maybe higher. Depending on the outdoor temps in your area, the pile might heat up even faster. Whatever happens, I want to encourage you to monitor the crap out of this pile, because the whole point of doing this, making IMO3, is to diversify and multiply your microbes. You're going to get weird looks from your neighbors, okay, especially if people are like walking by as you film a pile of what looks like dried leaves and wood shavings. But oh boy, they have no idea what is happening there. What is happening there? Well, the IMOs that we caught in the forest and preserved in brown sugar are getting the chance to feast on a new food source. In my case, wheat bran, oats, wood shavings, and leaf mold. And what happens when they start feeding is that they adapt, multiply, and select for new traits that allow them to better digest the materials. Different types of fungi and bacteria are suited to digest different types of food. Now what happens is that while they go into the feeding frenzy, they start generating heat because they're sweating. Literally, they're respirating carbon dioxide, water vapor, and heat. But here's the thing, to maximize and maintain microbial diversity, we need to keep the temperatures of the environment below 120 degrees Fahrenheit or 49 degrees Celsius. And ideally, we get into that above 110 range or 43 C. So the goal here really is to create a pile that heats up to between 110 and stays under 120 for as long as possible. The pile will eventually cool down on its own after the microbes finish their feeding frenzy, but it's likely, very likely, like maybe completely likely, that you will have to manually manage the temperature of your pile. And the reason that I say this is because if you don't, the pile is going to overheat. It's going to kill off those mesophilic microbes, and it's going to start getting dominated by thermophilic bacteria who won't chill out. No pun intended, and they're going to steal the space for themselves. So fungal diversity is greatly limited when this thing creeps much past 120 Fahrenheit, 49 Celsius, and that's why when you notice your pile, whether you're making IMO3, 4, or 5, you're going to want to spread it out. And I do this literally every time. You're going to spread it out with a rake or a shovel and let the heat dissipate for a good 30 minutes or so. Once the materials have cooled off, you're going to want to repile that so that it can heat back up, and those robust microbes can continue to get established in that mesophilic zone. Now this whole process, watching the pile heat up, seeing the fuzzy biology consume the pile, the whole thing is really exciting to me, even after having done it quite a bit. But you know who also really likes IMO is chickens. These gals are stoked to be a part of it because they know what's up. They're gonna get some of this stuff in their pen before long, but not quite yet. Eventually, like I said, the pile is gonna cool down on its own, and you can bag it up or store it or use it right away to make IMO4. Make sure that you store all of your IMO3 and beyond in breathable containers out of direct sunlight. I like burlap because I've got a good source from a local coffee shop owner. Cedar chests are pretty common, so I've heard. I have never owned a cedar chest. Maybe I will one day and I can use that. But for now, I've got burlap sacks. Now, a little summary. The purpose of IMO3 is to further diversify your IMO collection. IMO4 is where that diversified set of wild microbes are going to get to know your local garden microbes. It's like you're hosting a mixer so that people can get to know each other. You want the indigenous microorganisms to get to know the garden microorganisms so that they can properly integrate once they're applied to the garden soil. Otherwise, you run the risk of local nematodes and protozoa gobbling them up and not allowing them to establish their new home. They need to integrate prior to being used. So we're gonna do the same thing that we did with our IMO3. We're gonna mix up our dry ingredients first. This time, it just so happens that our inoculum is one of the dry ingredients, AKA IMO3. So we're gonna mix these up equal parts, and then we'll prepare our IMO water, this time sans IMO2, because it's already in there. And then we're gonna hydrate. Same as before, mix it up really good, make sure that there's no dry spots if possible. I find that sometimes I need to wait a little bit, give it some time, mix it again, give it some more time, and feel it with my hands, how damp or dry the materials are. It can take time for the dry materials to soak up the water, but once you've got a good consistency, it's time, same as before, to make a pile. Stick the thermometer in there, let it rock. Now for this pile, I made it toward the middle of our fall season where temps were just starting to creep downward into the upper 30s. And so it took a little bit for the temperatures to rise. In cases like this, and I found this especially relevant for IMO4 since soil is pretty dense material, it can help to do some light aeration by just sticking a pitchfork into the pile and lifting up some chunks to help incorporate air into the pile. This helps it to not go anaerobic also. I'm not trying to mix up the pile too much here, and I want to keep these chunks intact. You can see there's tons of inoculation happening. Great microbial development. It is so fun to see this happen in real time. Anyway, after aerating the pile a bit, I let it sit for a few more hours, and sure enough, it heated right up to about 119. Now at this point, it was approaching sundown, and I was about to go to bed in a few hours, so I went ahead and preemptively mixed up and spread out the pile so that it was just a tad shorter. This is what I typically do for young piles so that they don't overheat in the middle of the night. But I didn't have to worry about this one because I came out the next morning and we were looking at about 96 degrees. The next day I went to aerate it a bit more and show you some of these fungal aggregates that are forming. And again, leave these be. Don't break them up if you can. I just wanted to show you guys what you can look for. Now, same as IMO3, this pile came down temperature-wise all on its own. And at this point, it pretty much looks like soil. But this substance right here is what we can use to top dress our garden beds with. We can use it for a variety of different purposes as an inoculant. But as promised, we can also use it as the inoculum for IMO stage 5. And that's what we did here. For our IMO5, our dry ingredients are IMO4, our inoculum, and homemade compost, which is our substrate. We mixed them together, hydrated them with our IMO water, and piled it up. Now, beyond further diversifying the microbes from IMO4, we're also expanding the actual volume of our inoculant by doing this. So making IMO5 is another way that we can double it, make it go a little bit further. Of course, if you've got finished IMO4 and you've managed to keep the temperatures controlled and it's your first batch ever, you may not want risking overheating it just to make IMO5. So if you just barely made it to IMO4, feel free to use that. IMO5 is not a necessary step. I'm just doing it because I feel relatively confident in managing my pile. So before we conclude this video, I want to add a few personal comments and observations that I've made about this stuff. First of all, much like getting a good IMO1 collection, IMO3, 4, and 5 can be tricky. It took me quite a while to figure out how to get the ratios and hydration just right for my exact environment, my climate. And while I was figuring that out, it was really hard for me to manage the temperatures of the piles. I kept spiking way past 120, which isn't the end of the world if it goes above 120 for 30 minutes, but I was like losing control of it for long periods of time. And it just felt like I was never quite gonna be able to get it right. And even after I successfully managed my first pile, subsequent piles I made still overheated, and I had to keep working on it. Until now, I feel pretty confident about my ratios, my sense of how the piles are gonna do. And I know this sounds odd, but I can literally walk outside and smell my IMO3 pile, and based on how it smells, I kind of know if it's overheated or not, even without looking at it. It has a very pleasant, comforting, but distinct smell to me. Point is, this is both a very unique skill, not one that you necessarily want to brag about to your coworkers, but it is nonetheless a valuable one because making IMO4 and 5 yields you a crazy powerful soil inoculant that is impossible to purchase anywhere unless someone in your area is willing to make some for you using your own soil. If you are struggling to keep your pile maintained, temperature-wise, there are a few factors that you'll want to look for, and those are hydration, height, and ratios. For the ratios, I'm referring to the carbon to carbohydrate source ratio in IMO3, and in my opinion and experience, IMO3 is the one that is most likely to overheat due to an excess of carbohydrates or not enough carbon material. If your pile keeps heating up super quickly and seems like it's out of control, try adding more carbon material to your next pile to keep it cooler. On the other hand, if your pile struggles to heat up, it could be due to a lack of carbohydrate. Moisture is another key factor. If a pile isn't properly hydrated, it can struggle to heat up, and if a pile is overhydrated, it can start to smell ammonia-like, and that could be a sign that the pile is going anaerobic and the less favorable bacteria are taking over the pile. If that happens, flip it, spread it out so you can dry out a little bit, and you might be able to salvage the pile. Height is also a critical factor when it comes to a pile under or overheating, and basically if you want to try to get your pile to heat up faster, pile your materials higher, and if you want it to keep your temps controlled and a bit lower, try spreading out your pile a little bit thinner. Overall, make sure that you don't compress your piles. You want them to be fluffed up and aerated while also holding on to moisture. It's kind of one of those interesting balances. Guys, this is part 2 in our realistic guide to IMO series. We'll be releasing the full video soon if it's not already out there by the time you watch this, so stay tuned for that so you can catch how to make liquid IMO and all the ways that you can apply it. Make sure to check out our free beginner's guide to IMO, the revised and updated version, linked in the video description. And if you want to learn more about how to get a perfect IMO collection every time, you'll want to check out this video next. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.